This year's NATO summit held all the more significance as it marked 75 years since its founding, welcomed Sweden as its 32nd member, and is the last summit to be led by Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. It also came as the world has its eyes fixed on U.S. President Biden as he sought to prove his leadership and fitness amid mounting pressure to drop out after his debate fiasco. And above all, the summit came at a time when the alliance is faced with perhaps the most dangerous security challenges since the Cold War era, amid persisting war in Ukraine and growing military ties between North Korea and Russia. Reflecting the grave threats, leaders of NATO member nations issued a joint communique on the second day of the three-day summit, pledging long-term support for Ukraine and vowing to counter common threats together in solidarity. Now, without further ado, let's get expert insights on this summit's outcome so far and what we can expect ahead. For that, Kim Yang-yu, principal researcher at the East Asia Institute, joins us virtually. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And we are always delighted to have with us Evans Revere, former acting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State and non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Good of you to join us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
All right, Professor Kim, let's start off with you. Leaders of NATO member countries issued the Washington Summit Declaration on Wednesday. Walk us through the key points and your thoughts on central issues such as aid to Ukraine, expanding partnerships with the Indo-Pacific, and deterrence against Russia as well as China.
Well, let me set aside the discussion on expanding the partnership with the Indo-Pacific for later, and I believe we will have time to talk about the Russia and China more later. So I will briefly just highlight the key points of the declaration that deserve our attention. And firstly, the most striking change from last year's summit is evidently regarding Ukraine. Last year's summit simply mentioned that Ukraine's path to full Euro-Atlantic integration has moved beyond the need for the membership action plan, implying that Ukraine is basically ready to join NATO, but without specifying the timing. However, this year's declaration stated that we will continue to support Ukraine on its irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership. Of course, we all know that it is difficult to extend membership to Ukraine when it is still at war, as it will invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So affirming Ukraine's irreversible path is a significant step forward, I believe. And additionally, while not explicitly committing to multi-year financial support, pledging a minimum funding of 40 billion euros to assist Kyiv in maintaining combat endurance is noteworthy as well. The establishment of NATO security assistance and training for Ukraine to coordinate military equipment provision and training is also crucial. And secondly, the Washington Summit Declaration acknowledged that more than two-thirds of NATO members, specifically 23 allies, have fulfilled their commitment of at least 2% of GDP annual defense spending. And this achievement is significant for President Biden, I believe, especially considering that only 9 countries met this condition when he took office. So I think he can use to bolster his presidential campaign against Trump. And lastly, I found it compelling how the declaration clarifies the operation of the authoritarian partnerships. It defines Russia as a primary aggressor, violating numerous international laws and norms, with China identified as the decisive enabler supporting Russia's defense industrial base. Additionally, North Korea and Iran are noted for providing direct military support to Russia, including munitions, artillery shells, ballistic missiles, and UAVs. This underscores the NATO allies' unity in their awareness of the shifting geopolitical landscape, which is essential for collective security, I believe.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this also marks the first time that NATO members have officially criticized China for supporting Russia in its fight against Ukraine.
Yes.
The declaration also strongly condemned North Korea's weapons exports to Russia. So quite strong warnings, not only to Russia, NATO's primary threat, but also to China and North Korea as well. Dr. Revere, opening the summit, U.S. President Joe Biden delivered a forceful speech promising Ukraine more military hardware while also seeking to use the opportunity opportunity to reset his stumbling campaign amid his debate crisis. Do you think the speech and his leadership in NATO shown so far will help quell Democrats' concerns?
Well, it's indeed been a difficult time for President Biden because, as you suggested, his debate performance was not quite up to par in his debate with Donald Trump. That performance obviously undermined the president's candidacy for the presidency of the United States in a pretty significant way. It was therefore particularly important for President Biden to demonstrate strength, capability, and dynamic leadership at the NATO Summit. And I think he did exactly that with ease, I would add, and with a very decisive tone. The NATO speech was a valuable reminder of one of the greatest successes of Biden's presidency, the creation of this international coalition to support Ukraine's resistance to Russia's invasion. That coalition-forming event breathed new life into NATO. It gave the alliance an historic new mission and demonstrated the strength and the indispensability of U.S. international leadership. And those things, of course, have been central themes of Biden's presidency. When you see this accomplishment in light of Donald Trump's well-known attacks on NATO and NATO members, his rather dismissive attitude towards America's alliances and allies, including Korea, and his deeply disturbing suggestion a few months back that Russia should attack certain NATO countries. The contrast between Joe Biden as a leader and president and Donald Trump as a candidate for the presidency could not be starker. Biden did convey strength, leadership, and determination in his remarks at the NATO summit as he announced this new support for Ukraine, including new air defense systems. His statement that Russia will not prevail, Ukraine will prevail in the war was the clearest expression of U.S. determination I've heard to date. I think there is no doubt that Biden's remarks will be well received by America's NATO partners, by Ukraine, and by the United States' other allies around the world. But will this demonstration of leadership, vigor, and vision be enough to save Biden's candidacy? I'm not so sure. But it does signify that the United States, under President Biden's leadership, remains very deeply committed to preserving Ukraine's sovereignty and freedom, and is no less committed to all of its alliance partners. And that's a good message to have out there.
You highlighted a very important point. NATO actually appears to be stronger than ever before, and a lot of that has to be credited to President Biden. It is one of President Biden's signature achievements, right? Well, Mr. Biden will hold a high-stakes press conference today before wrapping up the summit, and we'll see how he handles the unscripted environment, and that's expected to be another critical moment for him.
Indeed.
Now, Dr. Kim, amid NATO's push to strengthen partnerships with Indo-Pacific nations, President Yoon is taking part for the third consecutive time. But a top U.S. official has clarified that although NATO has a wide opportunity for greater cooperation with the IP4, namely South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, NATO is not expanding into the Indo-Pacific. How do you see the possibility of the IP4 perhaps joining NATO in the future, and how would that change regional affairs?
Well, as you just mentioned, this will not happen during this summit for sure, and will likely remain the same, I think, in the future. More precisely, I believe that the IP4 do not need to join NATO. Here's why. But the recently concluded Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership between DPRK and Russia clearly reveal the security environments of Europe and the Pacific are closely linked, and South Korea has now become directly involved in European security landscape. This is because Pyongyang declared that ROK as its #1 hostile state, and Article 4 of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership stipulates that Russia shall provide military and other assistance using all the means it possesses without delay to the North Korea when it is at war. Considering that North Korea's primary adversary is now South Korea, relationship between Seoul and Moscow have shifted qualitatively from the past because of this. However, this does not mean that South Korea or Japan should join NATO, as Ambassador Carpenter, you mentioned earlier, clearly explained during the July 8th press briefing. NATO is not expanding into the Indo-Pacific, period. I think it should not. This is not just because we do not need to agitate Beijing over this, but I personally believe it is not necessary. The crux of the US's new strategic concept of integrated deterrence allows the US to integrate across regions. And the best way the allies can support the US in its fight to protect the rules-based international order is by stepping up their efforts to deter the primary security threats in their own regions like Russia and DPRK, allowing Washington to swiftly shift its main focus if needed. For example, if NATO members can support Ukraine by providing better air defense systems, F-16 fighter jets, more ammunition through spending more than 2% of their GDP, Washington could have more leeway to support Seoul in its effort to address the security threats from North Korea. In this regard, enhancing interoperability among the military assets of the US allies around the globe is much more important than NATO members joining South Korea in deterring DPRK or Seoul joining NATO to deter Moscow. I believe this is an effective, more efficient way to counter the rise of authoritarian partnership in Eurasia.
And Dr. Revere, NATO allies called China a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, sending out a much stronger than expected condemnation. China, on its part, has issued strong warnings from before the summit began, at one point urging NATO to avoid causing chaos in Asia. How would the summit impact U.S.-China relations that seem to be improving a little, facilitated by multiple high-level dialogues that we saw in recent months?
I find it very ironic that the PRC, which has concluded a partnership without limits with Russia, the PRC, which is supporting Russia's violation of international law and its unprovoked and inhumane aggression against a sovereign state, is complaining about chaos. Any chaos that has been created in Asia is the direct result of Russia's decision to expand the zone of combat against Ukraine to include the Korean Peninsula. And what I mean by that is that by concluding this new comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with North Korea, and particularly by laying the groundwork to enhance North Korea's missile-related capabilities, Russia is essentially signaling the United States, South Korea, and Japan that they will pay a price in the region for any support that they render to Ukraine. So the natural response to this Russian threat by Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo will be, of course, to increase their support for Ukraine and intensify their partnership against Beijing's North Korean ally. This is going to complicate China's security environment, indeed. I have to wonder whether China's leaders realize that their Russian partners, however, are endangering the PRC's security by creating a rationale for intra-regional and extra-regional cooperation to deal with this new Russia-North Korea cooperation. As for U.S.-China relations, if nothing else, current tensions underscore the continuing importance of dialogue between Washington and Beijing to try to find a way to avoid confrontation and conflict. This has always been a difficult task, and it remains so today.
And Dr. Kim, President Yoon, ahead of the summit, warned Russia that it must choose between the two Koreas where its true interests lie. The Kremlin immediately retorted that it does not agree with President Yoon's approach. What message would President Yoon send to Russia during the NATO summit, and how would it impact future Seoul-Moscow relations?
Well, I think Dr. Revere just explained beautifully, and I think Russia is taking dangerous steps and should understand the full implication of them. The President Yoon's message that Moscow should choose its next moves wisely is crucial because, as I mentioned earlier, North Korea is taking a completely different policy towards South Korea. It has abandoned its unification policy and no longer considers inter-Korean relations as a special relationship that shares the same ethnic and cultural identity. Instead, it views South Korea as a belligerent state, and Pyongyang is now actively planning to use tactical nuclear weapons on South Korean soil in the early phases of war, threatening the annihilation of the ROK. The security landscape on Korean Peninsula is tense because of this major shift in DPRK South Korea policy. And South Korea now needs to change its operational plan from being purely defensive to focusing on deterrence by denial measures like strengthening kill chain and military missile defense capabilities, and also deterrence by punishment measures such as enhancing its ability to destroy North Korea's command and control system. If Putin decides to provide Kim Jong-un with cutting-edge military technology such as hypersonic missiles, long-range surveillance capabilities based in space, and artificial intelligence and information technologies, it would nullify some of the main efforts that ROK and US alliance is making to counter intensifying military threats from the North. This action clearly crosses the red line that Seoul has drawn. If the Kremlin crosses this line, Seoul would be left with no choice but to do everything possible to frustrate a Russian victory in Ukraine, and bilateral relations would become as hostile as they were before.
And staying with you, Dr. Kim, President Yoon is expected to hold back-to-back summits with leaders from over 10 countries, including Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. What will be the focal points of discussion?
Yes, you're right. The president has serious bilateral talks already, actually, with the leaders of Germany, Netherlands, Canada, and Japan, and he will attend the IP4 minilateral meetings and other multilateral meetings between NATO members and IP4 countries tomorrow. And as President Yoon emphasized in his interview with Reuters on July 9th, the issue of Russia's illegal military partnership with the PRK that we've been talking this evening, which violates UN Security Council resolutions, of course, and has a great impact on the war in Ukraine, was discussed in all of these meetings, along with other pending issues in each country. For example, Germany expressed its intention to join United Nations Command and cooperation in the fields of semiconductor, as well as co-hosting the responsible AI in the military domain summit was discussed with the Netherlands, and 2+2 high-level diplomatic defense meetings and reciprocal cooperation in defense-related industrial sector were on the agenda items in the meeting with Canada. And with Prime Minister Kishida, President Yoon focused on the Seoul-Tokyo's close coordination with the US and international community to counter the impact of DPRK, Russia military and economic ties. And increased cooperation with all these important countries definitely serve national interests of South Korea, I believe. And I'm happy to hear that President Yoon managed to secure time to have these meetings. I hope he could do so more tomorrow.
And the final questions for you, Dr. Revere. Former President Trump's possible comeback to the White House appears to be a painful wake-up call to Europe that reminds them of their heavy reliance on America for defense. How would the U.S. presidential election impact the future of NATO?
Well, I think it's obvious that America's NATO and EU partners are looking at the upcoming U.S. presidential election with a serious mix of anxiety and trepidation. Over the years, Europe has indeed become heavily reliant on the United States for its defense. But the earlier Trump presidency provided a powerful wake-up call to Europe that Europe needed to lift its game, increase its defense budgets, enhance its military capabilities, and prepare for a world in which an inwardly focused United States might be less willing to fulfill its commitments to Europe's defense. Under the Biden presidency, the United States has strongly and repeatedly reassured NATO and European partners that it will stand by its treaty obligations and its commitments to its allies. Europe has, of course, welcomed this effort, but at the same time, the evidence shows that Europe is taking the necessary steps to deal with the possibility that Trump might return to the White House and re-implement an anti-alliance, America first and only approach to security. European countries are working hard to Trump-proof NATO and their security environment, to include making further efforts to increase budgets and enhance cooperation with each other. The future of NATO, of course, will depend largely on who wins the election in November. And if Trump is the victor, it will depend on whether and to what degree Donald Trump decides to reprise his anti-alliance stance. At this point, no one knows what Trump will do. So our friends in Europe are right to do whatever they can to limit the damage that a second Trump presidency might do to this critically important alliance.
All right, we'll leave it there tonight, but we'll be sure to closely monitor summit developments throughout today as well, because the IP4 members, including South Korea, are set to hold a session with NATO and EU leaders. Thank you so much, as always, Dr. Revere. We were so lucky to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to you as well, Dr. Kim, for your brilliant analysis.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.